Welcome to this compilation of 4 stories about great journeys in space. I'll be narrating The Stoker and the Stars by Algis Budrys, An Elephant for the Prinkip by L.J. Stecher Jr., Jonah of the Jove Run by Bradbury, and A Hitch in Space by Fritz Leiber. If you find yourself enjoying these stories, I'd like you to know that there are plenty more over on Substack, a platform I've been using to mitigate the difficulties of YouTube's inconsistent demonetization algorithms. There I publish 3 free stories a week, and paid subscribers get an extra video, a novelette or a novel in serialized form. All of that in video, audio and podcast form, and sent to you in one helpful email every Saturday. To sign up, head to storiesfromthesky.sff.substack.com, link in the description. But for now, let's get to the stories. So sit back, relax, and enjoy. The Stoker and the Stars by Algis Budrys, also known as John A. Sentry. Narrated by William Skye. When you've had your ears pinned back in a bow knot, it's sometimes hard to remember that an intelligent people has no respect for a whipped enemy, but does for a fairly beaten enemy. Know him? Yes, I know him. Knew him. That was 20 years ago. Everybody knows him now. Everybody who passed him on the street knows him. Everybody who went to the same schools or even to different schools in different towns knows him now. Ask them. But I knew him. I lived 3 feet away from him for a month and a half. I shipped with him and called him by his first name. What was he like? What was he thinking, sitting on the edge of his bunk with his jaw in his palm and his eyes on the stars? What did he think he was after? Well, I think he... I think I never did know him after all. Not well. Not as well as some of those people who are writing the books about him seem to. I couldn't really describe him to you. He had a duffel bag in his hand and a packed airsuit on his back. The skin of his face had been dried out by ship's air, burned by ultraviolet and broiled by infrared. The pupils of his eyes had little cloudy specks in them where the cosmic rays had shot through them. But his eyes were steady and his body was hard. What did he look like? He looked like a man. It was after the war, and we were beaten. There used to be a school of thought among us that deplored our combativeness. Before we had ever met any people from off-Earth even, you could hear people saying we were toughest, cruelest life form in the universe, unfit to mingle with the gentler, wiser races in the stars, and a sure bet to steal their galaxy and corrupt it forever. Where these people got their information, I don't know. We were beaten. We moved out beyond Centaurus and Sirius, and then we met the Jeks, the Nosaway, the Lud. We tried terrestrial know-how, we tried production miracles, we tried patriotism, we tried damming the torpedoes and full speed ahead, and we were smashed back like mayflies in the wind. We died in droves, and we retreated from the guttering fires of a dozen planets. We dug in, we fought through the last ditch, and we were dying on Earth itself before Baker mutinied, shot Cope, and surrendered the remainder of the human race to the wiser, gentler races in the stars. That way we lived. That way we were permitted to carry on our little concerns and mind our manners. The Jeks and the Lud and the Nosaway returned to their own affairs, and we knew they would leave us alone so long as we didn't bother them. We liked it that way. Understand me, we didn't accept it, we didn't knuckle under with waiting murder in our hearts. We liked it. We were grateful just to be left alone again. We were happy we hadn't been wiped out like the upstarts the rest of the universe thought us to be. When they let us keep our own solar system and carry on a trickle of trade with the outside, we accepted it for the fantastically generous gift it was. Too many of our best men were dead for us to have any remaining claim on these things in our own right. I know how it was. I was there 20 years ago. I was a little pudgy man with short breath and a high-pitched voice. I was a typical Earthman. We were out on a god-forsaken landing field on Mars, Macready and I, loading cargo aboard the Serenus. Macready was first officer. I was second. The stranger came walking up to us. "Got a job?" he asked, looking at Macready. Mac looked him over. He saw the same things I'd seen. He shook his head. "Not for you. The only thing we're short on is stokers." You wouldn't know. There's no such thing as a stoker anymore with automatic ships. But the stranger knew what Mac meant. Serenus had what they called an electronic drive. She had to run with an evacuated engine room. The leaking electricity would have broken any stray air down to ozone, which eats metal and rots lungs. So the engine room had the air pumped out of her, and the stokers who tended the dials and set the cathode attitudes had to wear suits, smelling themselves for 12 hours at a time, and standing a good chance of cooking where they sat when the drive arced. Serenus was an ugly old tub. At that, we were the better of the two interstellar freighters the human race had left. "You're bound over the border, aren't you?" Macready nodded. "That's right, but I'll stoke." Macready looked over toward me and frowned. I shrugged my shoulders helplessly. I was a little afraid of the stranger, too. The trouble was the look of him. It was the look you saw in the bars back on Earth where the veterans of the war sat and stared down into their glasses, waiting for night to fall so they could go out into the alleys and have drunken fights among themselves. But he had brought that look to Mars, to the landing field, and out here there was something disquieting about it. He'd caught Mac's look and turned his head to me. "I'll stoke," he repeated. I didn't know what to say. Macready and I, almost all of the men in the merchant marine, hadn't served in the combat arms. We had freighted supplies, and we had seen ships dying on the runs. We'd had our own brushes with commerce raiders, and we'd known enough men who'd joined the combat forces. But very few of the men came back, and the war this man had fought hadn't been the same as ours. He'd commanded a fighting ship somewhere, and come to grips with things we simply didn't know about. The mark was on him, but not on us. I couldn't meet his eyes. "Okay by me," I mumbled at last. I saw Macready's mouth turn down at the corners. But he couldn't gainsay the man any more than I could. Macready wasn't a mumbling man, so he said angrily, "Okay, bucko, you're stuck. Go and sign on." "Thanks." The stranger walked quietly away. He wrapped a hand around the cable on a cargo hook and rode into the hold on top of some freight. Mac spat on the ground and went back to supervising his end of the loading. I was busy with mine, and it wasn't until we'd gotten the Serenus loaded and buttoned up that Mac and I even spoke to each other again. Then we talked about the trip. We didn't talk about the stranger. Daniels, the third, had signed him on and had moved him into the empty bunk above mine. We slept all in a bunch on the Serenus, officers and crew. Even so, we had to sleep in shifts, with the ship's designers giving 90% of her space to cargo and 8% to power and control. That left very little for the people, who were crammed in any way they could be. I said empty bunk. What I meant was empty during my sleep shift. That meant he and I'd be sharing work shifts, me up in the control blister, parked in a soft chair, and him down in the engine room, broiling in a suit for 12 hours. But I ate with him, used the head with him. You can call that rubbing elbows with greatness if you want to. He was a very quiet man. Quiet in the way he moved and talked. When we were both climbing into our bunks that first night, I introduced myself and he introduced himself. Then he heaved himself into his bunk, rolled over on his side, fixed his straps, and fell asleep. He was always friendly toward me, but he must have been very tired that first night. I often wondered what kind of a life he'd lived after the war, what he'd done that made him different from the men who simply grew older in the bars. I wonder now if he really did do anything different. In an odd way, I like to think that one day in a bar, on a day that seemed like all the rest to him when it began, he suddenly looked up with some new thought, put down his glass, and walked straight to the Earth-Mars shuttle field. He might have come from any town on Earth. Don't believe the historians too much. Don't pay too much attention to the Chamber of Commerce plaques. When a man's name becomes public property, strange things happen to the facts. It was Macready who first found out what he'd done during the war. I've got to explain about Macready. He takes his opinions fast and strong. He's a good man, is or was, I haven't seen him for a long while, but he liked things simple. Macready said the duffel bag broke loose and floated into the middle of the bunk room during acceleration. He opened it to see whose it was. When he found out, he closed it up and strapped it back in its place at the foot of the stoker's bunk. Macready was my relief on the bridge. When he came up, he didn't relieve me right away. He stood next to my chair and looked out through the ports. "Captain leave any special instructions in the order book?" he asked. "Just the usual. Keep a tight watch and proceed cautiously." "That new Stoker," Mac said. "Yeah? I knew there was something wrong with him. He's got an old Marine uniform in his duffel." I didn't say anything. Mac glanced over at me. "Well?" "I don't know." I didn't. I couldn't say I was surprised. It had to be something like that about the Stoker. The mark was on him, as I've said. It was the Marines that did Earth's best dying. It had to be. They were trained to be the best we had, and they believed in their training. They were the ones who slashed back the deepest when the other side hit us. They were the ones who sallied out into the doomed spaces between the stars and took the war to the other side as well as any human force could ever hope to. They were always the last to leave an abandoned position. If Earth had been giving medals to members of her forces in the war, every man in the Corps would have had the Medal of Honor 2 and 3 times over. Posthumously. I don't believe there were 10 of them left alive when Cope was shot. Cope was one of them. They were a kind of human being neither Macready nor I could hope to understand. "You don't know," Mac said. "It's there. In his duffel. Damn it, we're going out to trade with his sworn enemies. Why do you suppose he wanted to sign on? Why do you suppose he's so eager to go?" "You think he's going to try to start something?" "Think? That's exactly what he's going for. One last big alley fight. One last brawl. When they cut him down, do you suppose they'll stop with him? They'll kill us, and then they'll go in and stamp Earth flat. You know it as well as I do." "I don't know, Mac," I said. "Go easy." I could feel the knots in my stomach. I didn't want any trouble. Not from the Stoker, not from Mac. None of us wanted trouble, not even Mac, but he'd cause it to get rid of it, if you follow what I mean about his kind of man. Mac hit the viewport with his fist. "Easy. Easy, nothing's easy. I hate this life," he said in a murderous voice. "I don't know why I keep signing on. Mars to Centaurus and back and forth in an old rust tub that's going to blow herself up one of these." Daniels called me on the phone from communications. "Turn up your intercom volume," he said. "The Stoker's jamming the circuit." I kicked the selector switch over, and this is what I got. "So there we were at 1,000,000 per, and the air was getting thick. The skipper says, 'Cheer up, brave boys, we'll—'" He was singing. He had a terrible voice, but he could carry a tune, and he was hammering it out at the top of his lungs. "'Twas the last cruise of the Venus. By God, you should have seen us. The pipes were full of whiskey, and just to make things risky, the jets were—" The crew were chuckling into their own chest phones. I could hear Daniels trying to cut him off, but he kept going. I started laughing myself. No one's supposed to jam an intercom, but it made the crew feel good. When the crew feels good, the ship runs right, and it had been a long time since they'd been happy. He went on for another 20 minutes. Then his voice thinned out and I heard him cough a little. "Daniels," he said, "get a relief down here for me. Jump to it." He said the last part in a master's voice. Daniels didn't ask questions. He sent a man on his way down. He'd been singing, the stoker had. He'd been singing while he worked with one arm dead, one sleeve ripped open and badly patched because the fabric was slippery with blood. There'd been a flashover in the drivers. By the time his relief got down there, he had the insulation back on and the drive was purring along the way it should have been. It hadn't even missed a beat. He went down to sick bay, got the arm wrapped, and would have gone back on shift if Daniels had let him. Those of us who were going off shift found him toying with the theremin in the mess compartment. He didn't know how to play it, and it sounded like a dog howling. "Sing, will ye?" somebody yelled. He grinned and went back to the good ship Venus. It wasn't good, but it was loud. From that we went to Starways, Farways and Barways, and the Freefall song. Somebody started I Left Her Behind for You, and that got us off into sentimental things, the way these sessions would sometimes wind up when spacemen were far from home. But not since the war, we all seemed to realize together. We stopped and looked at each other, and we all began drifting out of the mess compartment. And maybe it got to him too. It may explain something. He and I were the last to leave. We went to the bunk room and he stopped in the middle of taking off his shirt. He stood there looking out the porthole and forgot I was there. I heard him reciting something softly under his breath, and I stepped a little closer. This is what it was. The rockets rise against the skies, slowly in sunlight gleaming, with silver hue upon the blue, and the universe waits, dreaming. For men must go where the flame winds blow, the gas clouds softly plating, where stars are spun and worlds begun, and men will find them waiting. The song that roars where the rocket soars is the song of the stellar flame. The dreams of man and galactic span are equal and much the same. What was he thinking of? Make your own choice. I think I came close to knowing him at that moment, but until human beings turn telepath, no man can be sure of another. He shook himself like a dog out of cold water and got into his bunk. I got into mine, and after a while I fell asleep. I don't know what Macready may have told the skipper about the stoker, or if he tried to tell him anything. The captain was the senior ticket holder in the merchant service, and a good man in his day. He kept mostly to his cabin. And there was nothing Macready could do on his own authority, nothing simple, that is. And the stoker had saved the ship, and I think what kept anything from happening between Macready and the stoker, or anyone else and the stoker, was that it would have meant trouble in the ship. Trouble, confined to our little percentage of the ship's volume, could seem like something much more important than the fate of the human race. It may not seem that way to you, but as long as no one began anything, we could all get along. We could have a good trip. Macready worried, I'm sure. I worried sometimes. But nothing happened. When we reached Alpha Centaurus and set down at the trading field on the second planet, it was the same as the other trips we'd made, and the same kind of landfall. The Ludd factor came out of his post after we'd waited for a while and gave us our permit to disembark. There was a Jek ship at the other end of the field, loaded with the cargo we would get in exchange for our hold full of goods. We had the usual things, wine, music tape, furs, and the like. The Jeks had been giving us light machinery lately, Probably we'd get 2 or 3 more loads, and then they'd begin giving us something else. But I found that this trip wasn't quite the same. I found myself looking at the factor's post, and I realized for the first time that the Lud hadn't built it. It was a leftover from the old colonial human government. And the city on the horizon, men had built it. The touch of our architecture was on every building. I wondered why it had never occurred to me that this was so. It made the landfall different from all the others somehow. It gave a new face to the entire planet. Mac and I and some of the other crewmen went down on the field to handle the unloading. Jeks on self-propelled cargo lifts jockeyed among us, scooping up the loads as we unhooked the slings, bringing cases of machinery from their own ship. They sat atop their vehicles, lean and aloof, dashing in, whirling, shooting across the field to their ship and back like wild horsemen on the plains of Earth, paying us no notice. We were almost through when Mac suddenly grabbed my arm. "Look!" The stoker was coming down on one of the cargo slings. He stood upright, his booted feet planted wide, one arm curled up over his head and around the hoist cable. He was in his dusty brown marine uniform, the scarlet collar tabs bright as blood at his throat, his major's insignia glittering at his shoulders, the battle stripes on his sleeves. The Jeks stopped their lifts. They knew that uniform. They sat up in their saddles and watched him come down. When the sling touched the ground, he jumped off quietly and walked toward the nearest Jek. They all followed him with their eyes. "We've got to stop him," Mac said, and both of us started toward him. His hands were both in plain sight, one holding his duffel bag, which was swelled out with the bulk of his airsuit. He wasn't carrying a weapon of any kind. He was walking casually, taking his time. Mac and I had almost reached him when a Jek with insignia on his coveralls suddenly jumped down from his lift and came forward to meet him. It was an odd thing to see, the stoker and the Jek who did not stand as tall. Macready and I stepped back. The Jek was coal black, his scales glittering in the cold sunlight, his hatchet face inscrutable. He stopped when the stoker was a few paces away. The stoker stopped too. All the Jeks were watching him and paying no attention to anything else. The field might as well have been empty except for those two. "They'll kill him! They'll kill him right now!" Macready whispered. They ought to have. If I'd been a Jek, I would have thought that uniform was a death warrant. But the Jek spoke to him. "Are you entitled to wear that?" "I was at this planet in 39. I was closer to your homeworld the year before that," the stoker said. "I was captain of a destroyer. If I'd had a cruiser's range, I would have reached it." He looked at the Jek. "Where were you?" "I was here when you were." "I want to speak to your ship's captain." "All right, I'll drive you over." The stoker nodded and they walked over to his vehicle together. They drove away toward the Jek ship. "All right, let's get back to work," another Jek said to Macready and myself, and we went back to unloading cargo. The stoker came back to our ship that night without his duffel bag. He found me and said, "I'm signing off the ship, going with the Jeks." Macready was with me. He said loudly, "What do you mean you're going with the Jeks?" "I signed on their ship," the stoker said. "Stoking. They've got a micronuclear drive. It's been a while since I worked with one, but I think I'll make out all right, even with the screwball way they've got it set up." "Huh?" The stoker shrugged. "Ships are ships, and physics is physics, no matter where you go. I'll make out." "What kind of a deal did you make with them? What do you think you're up to?" The stoker shook his head. "No deal. I signed on as a crewman. I'll do a crewman's work for a crewman's wages. I thought I'd wander around a while. It ought to be interesting," he said. "On a Jek ship." "Anybody's ship," When I get to their home world, I'll probably ship out with some people from farther on. Why not? It's honest work." Macready had no answer to that. "But," I said. "What?" He looked at me as if he couldn't understand what might be bothering me, but I think perhaps he could. "Nothing," I said, and that was that, except Macready was always a sourer man from that time up to as long as I knew him afterwards. We took off in the morning. The stoker had already left on the Jack ship, and it turned out he'd trained an apprentice boy to take his place. It was strange how things became different for us, little by little, after that. It was never anything you could put your finger on, but the Jacks began taking more goods and giving us things we needed when we told them we wanted them. After a while, Serenus was going a little deeper into Jack territory, and when she wore out, the 2 replacements let us trade with the Lud, too. Then it was the Nossorway and the other people beyond them, and things just got better for us somehow. We heard about our stoker, occasionally. He shipped with the Lud and the Nossorway and some people beyond them, getting along, going to all kinds of places. Pay no attention to the precise red lines you see on the star maps. Nobody knows exactly what path he wandered from people to people. Nobody could. He just kept signing on with whatever ship was going deeper into the galaxy, going farther and farther. He messed with green shipmates and blue ones. 1 and 2 and 3 heads, tails, 6 legs. After all, ships are ships, and they've all got to have something to push them along. If a man knows his business, why not? A man can live on all kinds of food if he wants to get used to it, and any non-toxic atmosphere will do as long as there's enough oxygen in it. I don't know what he did to make things so much better for us. I don't know if he did anything but stoke their ships and, I suppose, fix them when they were in trouble. I wonder if he sang dirty songs in that bad voice of his to people who couldn't possibly understand what the songs were about. All I know is, for some reason, those people slowly began treating us with respect. We changed too, I think. I'm not the same man I was, I think. Not altogether the same. I'm a captain now, with master's papers, and you won't find me in my cabin very often. There's a kind of joy in standing on a bridge, looking out at the stars you're moving toward. I wonder if it mightn't have kept my old captain out of that place he died in, finally, if he'd tried it. So, I don't know. The older I get, the less I know. The thing people remember the stoker for, the thing that makes him famous and I think annoys him, I'm fairly sure is only incidental to what he really did. If he did anything. If he meant to. I wish I could be sure of the exact answer he found in the bottom of that last glass at the bar before he worked his passage to Mars and the Serenus and began it all. So I can't say what he ought to be famous for. But I suppose it's enough to know for sure that he was the first living being ever to travel all the way around the galaxy. An Elephant for the Prinkip by L.J. Stecher, Jr. Narrated by William Skye. A Delta-class freighter can carry anything, maybe more than its skipper can bear. A Delta-class freighter isn't pretty to look at, but it can be adapted to carry most anything, and occasionally even to carry it profitably. So when I saw one I didn't recognize sitting under the gantry at Helmholtz Spaceport, I hurried right over to operations. It looked as if I might be able to get my Gasha route off-planet before it started to spoil after all. It was the Delta Crucis, they told me. She was a tramp and she hadn't yet been signed for a cargo. The skipper was listed as his own agent. They told me where they thought I could find him, so I drifted over to the spaceport bar and looked around. I found my man quickly enough. He had the young old look of a deep spacer. He wore a neat but threadbare blue uniform with the 4 broad gold rings of command, rather tarnished, on each sleeve. He had a glass of real, a liquor that was too potent for my taste, in front of him at 10 o'clock in the morning, and that wasn't a good sign. But he looked sober enough. So I picked up a large schooner of beer at the bar and strolled over to his table in the far corner away from the window. "Mind if I join you?" I asked casually. "I hate to drink alone." He stared at me for a minute out of those pale blue spacer's eyes of his until I figured he thought he had me catalogued. Then he motioned me to the chair across from his at the small table. We sat for a few minutes in silence, sizing each other up. "That's a mighty nice-looking freighter out there on pad 7, I said at last. "Yours?" He uncapped his glass, took a sip of real, snicked the cover back and let the heady stuff evaporate in his mouth. He breathed in sharply in the approved manner, but he didn't even shudder. He just nodded slowly once. That appeared to pass the conversational ball back to me. "I might have a cargo for you if you can handle it," I said. "I hear these Delta-class ships can manage almost anything, but this is a rough one. The Annabelle is the only ship in the area built to take my stuff, and she's grounded with transposer troubles." He cocked one sandy eyebrow at me. I interpreted this to be a request for the nature of my cargo, so I told him and let him ponder about it for a while. "Gasharoot," he said at last, and nodded once. "I can handle it. That'll be easy for Delta Crucis. Like you said, she can handle anything. Her last cargo was a live elephant." We completed our deal without much trouble. He drove a hard bargain, but a fair one, and he had plenty of self-confidence. He signed a contingent on satisfactory delivery contract, and that's unusual for a ship that's handling Gasha. Hadn't thought I'd be so lucky. Gasha is tricky stuff. We went over to the government office to complete the deal, customs arrangements, notarizations, posting bonds, and so forth, but we finally signed the contract, all legal and binding. His name turned out to be Bart Hanna. Then, by unspoken consent, we went back to the bar. It was afternoon by that time, so I had a scotch, and then I had another. I was so relieved to have found a ship for my cargo that I didn't even think about lunch. I got more and more mellow and talkative as time went by, but the skipper just sat there breathing real. He didn't seem to change a bit. Something had been bothering me, though, and I finally figured out what it was. So I stopped talking about my farming troubles and asked Captain Hanna a direct question. "You say you carried an elephant?" I asked. "A live elephant? In a spaceship?" He nodded. "It's an animal," he said. "A very large animal, from Earth." "I know all about that," I said. "We're civilized here. We're not just a bunch of back-planet hicks, you know. We study all about the home planet at school. But why, and how, would anyone take an elephant into space?" He stared at me for a while, then took a deep breath and let it out slowly. "I'll tell you," he said. "After all, it's nothing to be really ashamed of." He pondered for a full minute. "It all started a few standard months ago on Condor, over in Sector 64W. 64W? I broke in. "That's clear over on the other side of the galaxy." He looked at me for a while and then just went on as if I hadn't spoken. "I'd been doing all right with Delta Crucis," he said, "and salting away plenty of cash, but I wasn't satisfied. It was mostly short-haul stuff, 10 or 20 light years, and it was mostly run-of-the-mill loads. Fleeda Jewels, Karan, Morabfer, that sort of thing, you know. I was getting bored. They said a Delta-class freighter could carry just about anything, and I wanted to prove it. So when I heard that a rich eccentric one planet out on Penguin might have an interesting job for me, I flitted right over. The Prinkip of Penguin wasn't just rich, he was rich. Penguin has almost twice the diameter of this planet, but it's light enough to have about the same surface gravity. To give you an idea, its two biggest bodies of water are about the size of the Atlantic Ocean back on the Earth you've studied so much about. On Penguin they call them lakes. And the Prinkip owns the whole planet, free and clear. I should be so lucky with the Delta Crucis. The Prinkip is a little skinny man, but that doesn't keep him from having a large-sized hobby to go with his large-sized planet. The Prinkip collects animals, one from each planet in his sector. He had a zoo with nearly 300 monsters in it, always a sample of the largest kind from whatever planet it came from. He showed me around. It was the damnedest sight you ever saw. He had one animal called a pfleeg. It was almost 200 feet long. It walked around on 2 legs and sang like a bird. He had another one that had 234 legs on a side. I counted them. It had 4 sides. Didn't care which one was up. He had animals under glass that didn't breathe at all. He had one animal under a microscope that was about 1/1000th of an inch long, but he told me that it was the biggest one on Fartolp. He had a big satellite stuck up overhead in a 1 revolution a day orbit for animals that needed light gravity. He had 37 more beasts in that. All in all, he had one animal from every planet in Sector 64W that had life. He figured that he needed just one more animal to complete his collection. He wanted a sample of a creature from the home planet, one live and healthy sample of Earth's biggest animal. And he wanted to know if I could ship it to him. Well, I didn't give the matter too much thought. After all, I said to myself, if somebody had managed a 300-ton monster almost 200 feet long, I ought to be able to manage a little bitty elephant. So I said yes, and I gave him a contingent on satisfactory delivery contract for one adult specimen of Earth's largest animal, male or female, in good condition. It wasn't until about that time that the Prinkip told me how that biggest monster had been shipped. It had arrived in a cardboard box wrapped in cotton. It seems that pfleeg eggs weigh just a little under 3 ounces. Well, I'd been done, but I still figured I could make delivery. He lapsed into silence for a moment, thinking deeply. Did you know that there are 2 kinds of elephants on Earth, the African and the Indian, and that they aren't exactly the same size? He asked. I shook my head. Our schools don't go that far, I said. He nodded. Neither do ours, so I immediately bought an Indian elephant. They're the kind back on the home planet that you can find tame and easy to handle. They're also the wrong kind. The only reason I didn't head right back with it is that I was having trouble figuring out how to carry it in the Crucis. Even an Indian elephant weighs about 6 tons. At least mine did. In itself, that's not a very big load, but the trip back would take a good many months of subjective time, and of course elephants eat on subjective time. And how they eat. The food I carried would weigh the same as the elephant. I wondered how elephants would like weightlessness, so I took my Indian elephant up on a little jaunt around Earth's satellite. The moon, they call it. Elephants don't like weightlessness at all. He paused and signaled the bartender for another drink. I hope you never have to clean up after a space-sick elephant, he said darkly. That meant that I'd have to put spin on the Crucis for the entire trip back to Penguin. It's hard enough to try to navigate in hyperspace with spin on your ship, but that wasn't the worst of it. An elephant is a tremendous amount of off-center load for a ship with a large fraction of a 1G spin on it. Too much load even to think about handling. Even though I couldn't come up with an answer right offhand, I went ahead and turned in my Indian elephant on an African model. Beulah was her name, and she was a husky girl. She weighed in at just a little more than 8 tons. I waved my whiskey glass at Captain Hannah. But I don't see your problem, I said. If you put the elephant on one side and his food on the other, there wouldn't be any off-balanced load, would there? Not until the food was eaten anyway, said the skipper witheringly, and I subsided with a fresh drink. Beulah was kind of cute for all of her tonnage, said the skipper. She had 2 enormous tusks and a pair of ears like wings, and a nose that was longer than her tail. But she was mighty friendly after she got to know me. She'd pick me up and carry me around if I asked her to, and she'd eat right out of my hand. She turned out to be even tamer than the Indian elephant. All I had to do was figure out how to carry her. For a starter, I figured, like you said, to have Beulah on one side of the cargo compartment and her chow on the other. Then I calculated to have my own supplies on the other two sides of the space, so that I could move them away from her as her food stocks got smaller and hold the balance that way. That wasn't enough, of course, so I built a couple of water tanks on the opposite side of the ring from Beulah. As you know, not much can be done about moving water around in a spaceship. It's got its own cooling chores to perform, but every little bit helped. Finally, I jockeyed the master computer and the auxiliary computer down and ran them on track so I could slide them around to compensate for Beulah's appetite. Some lead slugs brought the auxiliary's weight up equal to the master's, and they also brought my total load up to the absolute maximum that I could carry. It was almost enough. But a miss is as good as a mile for a spaceship. I was stuck, and there didn't seem to be a thing I could do about it. Even if I could have carried more weight, it wouldn't have helped. Any more mass in the cargo compartment would have thrown the CG too far aft. He beckoned for more Riel. "So what did you do?" I prompted. "You did say that you carried the elephant, didn't you?" "Sure. Like I said, a Delta-class freighter can do almost anything. Beulah gave me the answer herself. If you've ever lived with an elephant, one thing becomes clear mighty fast. They're a mighty efficient machine for converting fodder into elephant droppings. So I made a bin on the opposite side of the compartment from Beulah and let her gradually fill it while she ate me out of balance. The weight of what's a nice word for it, was just enough to let me keep the whole setup in dynamic balance. Compost heap? I suggested dreamily, picturing the arrangement in my mind. There was poetry in it. Or was it poetic justice that I had in mind? "That's it," said Captain Hannah. "Compost heap. Well, I started the journey with the ship full and Beulah and the compost heap empty. I finished pretty much the other way around. I suppose it sounds easy, but it wasn't. I started off with Beulah chained down in the middle of the compartment and everything stacked around her. She didn't want me to leave when I went up to the bridge to take off and hollered as piteously as you can imagine. But I couldn't have a nurse for her, mahout they call them. I couldn't spare the weight, or the salary for that matter. She was chained down so she couldn't move around and upset the balance. After chemical takeoff, we slid into parking orbit as sweet as you please. I hurried down to shift the load around. I didn't want to stay weightless any longer than I had to because I remembered that sick Indian elephant, and Beulah outweighed him by almost 2 tons and had a larger stomach to match. Of course, the Indian elephant had gone into orbit on a full belly, and I hadn't let Beulah have a bite to eat for hours. It made a difference, let me tell you. Beulah made trouble in her own way, though. As soon as I got within reach, she grabbed me with that long nose of hers and wouldn't let go. She didn't hurt me or anything like that. She just wanted company in her misery. I couldn't coax her with food. The very thought of food made her shudder. I couldn't reach her chains to cut her loose, and I couldn't reach the radio to call for help. If it hadn't been for the ionosphere guard, I might have starved to death. I'd hired the parking orbit for 12 hours, and when I was still in it after that time, port control started to holler. I could hear them on my loudspeaker, but I couldn't answer them. So the ionosphere guard finally sent up a small craft with a lieutenant and a 3-man crew in it to see what was wrong. Those sailors were good. They didn't even look surprised. They just went to work as if they handled elephants in space every day. They drove 4 lines through the ring bolts I'd welded in the spin deck, cast Beulah loose, and hauled her over to her new spot as neat as you please. Then, no nonsense, the lieutenant ordered Beulah to let loose of me. She did, too. After that they left, stopping for just 1 drink of my good bourbon. I didn't drink Rial then. I wirelessed port control my penalty fees and another 12 hours higher in the orbit and started shifting the load. I was working on an empty stomach and Beulah still didn't feel hungry, so she didn't remind me that I hadn't eaten. I almost collapsed before I got the job done. Then I put spin on, which made Beulah comfortable at last, and tried to juggle the ship into a hyper trajectory, still without stopping for food or sleep. It didn't take long before Beulah started squalling for supper. After I fed her, I had to adjust balance all over again. By that time, I was pushing my new 12-hour limit, and I didn't give much of a damn anymore. I just counted to 10 and pushed the button. Then I turned in and slept until Beulah started squalling for breakfast. I ignored her until I ate about 3 squares in a row, then I fed her and adjusted balance. After that, I checked my trajectory. It was the best I've ever made in 24 years of jumping. It was beautiful. So I turned back in again and slept until Beulah woke me for lunch. I didn't know it at the time, but Beulah was eating for 2. That possibility probably should have occurred to me earlier, what with the name Beulah, but you can't think of everything, and there I was, the first man to go into hyperspace with an elephant. Anyway, it didn't even worry me, even when I found out about it. I checked the contract. Everything seemed to be well covered. And according to my book on elephants, Beulah should still be only a potential mother when we reached Penguin. As a matter of fact, the whole idea made me feel just a little bit proud. Like a father, you know? What with having to shift weights after every meal and Beulah setting the schedule for meals, I was kept mighty busy. My self-winding wristwatch overwound itself and stopped in spite of the advertisements about it, and I didn't find out for almost 2 weeks, subjective, that Beulah's stomach ran fast. What's more, I think she knew it. Because when I finally woke up to what was going on and started to run her schedule by the clock, she didn't fuss a bit. Beulah's a clever girl. I was so worn out when we finally reached Penguin that I just slid into orbit, kept spin on, laid out a couple of extra meals for Beulah, and slept the clock around. The Prinkip was mighty mad about it when I finally turned on my radio, but I told him I had my cargo ready for delivery and where did he want me to put it. So he calmed down and gave me the coordinates. Of course, I had to take off the spin and shift Beulah back to the landing deck, and there wasn't any ionosphere guard around to help me if I got into any kind of trouble. So I was mighty careful. I put the chains on Beulah again, and then set up trip ropes so I could cut her loose without getting inside of reach of that nose of hers. Then I ran lines back to the first set of ring bolts so I could drag her back weightless without any trouble. Beulah looked a little unhappy, but didn't make any fuss about it all. I started to take spin off, giving the orders to the angle jets through the computer right down in the cargo compartment so the old girl wouldn't worry about where I was. Beulah didn't squall as her weight came off this time. She just reached down and tripped loose the chains around her ankles. Did I tell you that she was mighty clever? I nodded. Well, she started around that spin deck after me. I punched into the computer the maximum order for spin reduction and started around the spin deck to keep away from her. Beulah grabbed hold of the computer with her nose, for support I guess, when she got over there. She yanked the whole thing clear off the deck, breaking its cable. Crucis lurched once, and I ended up in the compost heap. With Beulah way off center and with that last wild burst from the jets before they cut off, the ship was gyrating in a way that made my stomach uneasy. It didn't seem to bother Beulah, though. She just wanted to be near me. I got out of there fast and went up onto the bridge. The main computer was out, of course. I couldn't interrogate the auxiliary computer remotely, so I had to fly that wobbling ship to a stop by the seat of my pants. I did it, too. Then I went back to the cargo compartment and hauled Beulah into the center. She didn't make any more trouble. She was sorry for what she had done. The coordinates the Prinkip had given me looked almighty close to a big pond that I didn't recall having seen before, but I was too busy making a landing with minimum fuel to ask him about it. I finally fought her down safely with one leg of my tripod actually in the pond and clouds of steam rising up around Delta Crucis. I call it a pond, but on a normal-sized planet it would be a good big lake. Anyway, I had made it safely to Penguin and my elephant was alive and healthy. I congratulated Beulah when I untied her, and then I took her outside to meet the Prinkip. I think I was a little proud of myself, and of Beulah, and of Delta Crucis, too. I was so stirred by hearing about the successful conclusion of Captain Hannah's mission that I shook his hand warmly and ordered a round of drinks for everyone in the room. Fortunately, it was not very crowded at the time. "That's not quite the end of the story," said the skipper. "You see, the Prinkip had built the pond to keep Beulah in. He had somehow gotten the idea that I was bringing him a whale." I looked blank. "An earth mammal. It lives in the oceans and runs to maybe 70 or 80 tons. I sat down slowly and then made a sudden dive for my contract for the use of the Delta Crucis. The skipper nodded. "I had a contingent contract with the Prinkip too," he said, "and I hadn't delivered. I still haven't figured out how to make delivery of a whale, but I will someday. And if you're looking for that part of our contract where you agree to store any residual cargo I may be carrying, it's all legal and binding. Until I get back from hauling your Gasha route, you'll have to care for one adult female African elephant. But I'm sure you'll get to like Beulah as much as I have. She's a mighty clever elephant." I called the waiter over and ordered a beaker of Real. "But you're lucky at that," said Hannah. "Check subparagraph F of paragraph 74 of our contract. Incidental accrual. When Beulah has her baby, the little tyke will be all yours." Now I know why Captain Hannah drinks Real in the morning. So do I. If you're enjoying the stories, hit the like button to support the channel. Thanks. Jonah of the Jove Run by Ray Bradbury. Narrated by William Skye. They hated this little beat-up old guy. Even if his crazy cosmic brain could track a meteor clear across the galaxy, why did he have to smash the supersensitive detectors? Nibley stood in the changing shadows and sounds of Marsport, watching the great supply ship Terror being entered and left by a number of officials and mechanics. Something had happened. Something was wrong. There were a lot of hard faces and not much talk. There was a bit of swearing, and everybody looked up at the night sky of Mars, waiting. But nobody came to Nibley for his opinion or his help. He stood there, a very old man, with a slack-gummed face and eyes like the little bubbly stalks of crayfish looking up at you from a clear creek. He stood there fully neglected. He stood there and talked to himself. "They don't want me or need me," he said. "Machines are better nowadays. Why should they want an old man like me with a taste for Martian liquor? They shouldn't. A machine isn't old and foolish and doesn't get drunk." Way out over the dead sea bottoms, Nibley sensed something moving. Part of himself was suddenly awake and sensitive. His small, sharp eyes moved in his withered face. Something inside of his small skull reacted, and he shivered. He knew. He knew that what these men were watching and waiting for would never come. Nibley edged up to one of the astrogators from the Terror. He touched him on the shoulder. "Say," he said. "I'm busy," said the astrogator. "I know," said Nibley, "but if you're waiting for that small repair rocket to come through with the extra auxiliary asteroid computator on it, you're wasting your time." "Like hell," said the astrogator, glaring at the old man. "That repair rocket's got to come through, and quick. We need it. It'll get here." "No, it won't," said Nibley sadly, and shook his head and closed his eyes. "It just crashed a second ago out on the dead sea bottom. I felt it crash. I sensed it going down. It'll never come through." "Go away, old man," said the astrogator. "I don't want to hear that kind of talk. It'll come through. Sure, it has to come through." The astrogator turned away and looked at the sky, smoking a cigarette. "I know it as a fact," said Nibley, but the young astrogator wouldn't listen. He didn't want to hear the truth. The truth was not a pleasant thing. Nibley went on to himself. I know it for a fact, just like I was always able to know the course of meteors with my mind, or the orbits or parabolas of asteroids. I tell you. The men stood around waiting and smoking. They didn't know yet about the crash out there. Nibley felt a great sorrow rise in himself for them. That ship meant a great deal to them, and now it had crashed. Perhaps their lives had crashed with it. A loudspeaker on the outer area of the landing tarmac opened out with a voice. Attention, crew of the Terror. The repair ship just radioed in a report that it has been fired upon from somewhere over the Dead Seas. It crashed a minute ago. The report was so sudden and quiet and matter-of-fact that the standing smoking men did not for a moment understand it. Then, each in his own way, they reacted to it. Some of them ran for the radio building to verify the report. Others sat down and put their hands over their faces. Still more of them stood staring at the sky, as if staring might put the repair ship back together again and get it here safe and intact. Instinctively, at last, all of them looked up at the sky. Jupiter was there, with its coterie of moons, bright and far away. Part of their lives lived on Jupiter. Most of them had children and wives there, and certain duties to perform to ensure the longevity of said children and wives. Now, with the speaking of a few words over a loudspeaker, the distance to Jupiter was suddenly an immense impossibility. The captain of the rocket Terror walked across the field slowly. He stopped several times to try and light a cigarette, but the night wind blew it out. He stood in the rocket's shadow and looked up at Jupiter and swore quietly again and again, and finally threw down his cigarette and heeled it with his shoe. Nibley walked up and stood beside the captain. Captain Kroll? Kroll turned. Oh, hello, Grandpa. Tough luck. Yeah. I guess that's what you'd call it. Tough luck. You're going to take off anyway, Captain? Sure, said Kroll quietly, looking at the sky. Sure. How's the protective computator on board your ship? Not so hot. Bad, in fact. It might conk out before we get halfway through the asteroids. That's not good, said Nibley. It's lousy. I feel sick. I need a drink. I wish I was dead. I wish we'd never started this damned business of being damned pioneers. My family's up there. He jerked his hand halfway to Jupiter violently. He settled down and tried to light another cigarette. No go. He threw it down after the other. Can't get through the asteroids without an asteroid computator to protect you, without that old radar setup, Captain, said Nibley, blinking wetly. He shuffled his small feet around in the red dust. We had an auxiliary computator on that repair ship coming from Earth, said Kroll, standing there. And it had to crash. The Martians shoot it down, you think? Sure. They don't like us going up to Jupiter. They got claims there too. They'd like to see our colony die out. Best way to kill a colony is starve the colony. Starve the people. That means my family and lots of families. Then when you starve out the families, the Martians can step in and take over. Damn their filthy souls. Kroll fell silent. Nibley shifted around. He walked around in front of Kroll so Kroll would see him. Captain? Kroll didn't even look at him. Nibley said, Maybe I can help. You? You heard about me, Captain. You heard about me. What about you? You can't wait a month for another auxiliary computator to come through from Earth. You got to push off tonight to Jupiter to get to your family and the colony and all that, Captain, sure. Nibley was hasty. He sort of fidgeted around, his voice high and excited. And if your only computator conks out in the middle of the asteroids, well, you know what that means. Bang! No more ship. No more you. No more colony on Jupiter. Now you know about me, my ability. You know, you heard. Kroll was cool and quiet and far away. I heard about you, old man. I heard lots. They say you got a funny brain and do things machines can't do. I don't know. I don't like the idea. But you got to like the idea, Captain. I'm the only one can help you now. I don't trust you. I heard about your drinking that time and wrecking that ship. I remember that. But I'm not drinking now. See? Smell my breath. Go ahead. You see? Kroll stood there. He looked at the ship, and he looked at the sky, and then at Nibley. Finally, he sighed. Old man, I'm leaving right now. I might just as well take you along as leave you. You might do some good. What can I lose? Not a damned thing, Captain, and you won't be sorry, cried Nibley. Step lively, then. They went to the rocket, Kroll running, Nibley hobbling along after. Trembling excitedly, Nibley stumbled into the rocket. Everything had a hot mist over it. First time on a rocket in 10 years, by God. Good. Good to be aboard again. He smelled it. It smelled fine. It felt fine. Oh, it was very fine indeed. First time since that trouble he got into off the planet Venus. He brushed that thought away. That was over and past. He followed Kroll up through the ship to a small room in the prow. Men ran up and down the rungs. Men who had families out there on Jupiter and were willing to go through the asteroids with a faulty radar setup to reach those families and bring them the necessary cargo of machinery and food they needed to go on. Out of a warm mist, old Nibley heard himself being introduced to a third man in the small room. Douglas, this is Nibley, our auxiliary computating machine. A poor time for joking, Captain. It's no joke, cried Nibley. Here I am. Douglas eyed Nibley with a very cold and exact eye. No, he said. No, I can't use him. I'm computant mechanic. And I'm captain, said Kroll. Douglas looked at Kroll. We'll shove through to Jupiter with just our leaky set of radar computators. That's the way it'll have to be. If we're wrecked halfway, well, we're wrecked. But I'll be damned if I go along with a decrepit son of a witch doctor. Nibley's eyes watered. He sucked in on himself. There was a pain round his heart and he was suddenly chilled. Kroll started to speak, but a gong rattled and banged, and a voice shouted. Stations! Gunners up! Hammocks! Take off! Take off! Stay here! Kroll snapped it at the old man. He leaped away and down the rungs of the ladder, leaving Nibley alone in the broad shadow of the bitter-eyed Douglas. Douglas looked him up and down in surly contempt. So you know arcs, parabolas and orbits as good as my machines, do you? Nibley nodded, angry now that Kroll was gone. Machines, shrilled Nibley, can't do everything. They ain't got no intuition. Can't understand sabotage and hatreds and arguments. Or people. Machines are too damn slow. Douglas lidded his eyes. You're faster? I'm faster, said Nibley. Douglas flicked his cigarette toward a wall disposal slot. Predict that orbit. Nibley's eyes jerked. Gonna miss it. The cigarette lay smouldering on the deck. Douglas scowled at the cigarette. Nibley made wheezy laughter. He minced to his shock hammock, zipped into it. Not bad, eh? The ship rumbled. Angrily, Douglas snatched up the cigarette, carried it to his own hammock, rolled in, zipped the zipper, then, deliberately, he flicked the cigarette once more. It flew. "Another miss," predicted Nibley. Douglas was still glaring at the flawed cigarette when the rocket burst gravity and shot up into space toward the asteroids. Mars dwindled into the sun. Asteroids swept silently down the star tracks, all metal, all invisible, shifting and shifting to harry the rocket. Nibley sprawled by the great thick visiport, feeling the computators giving him competition under the floor and the level below, predicting meteors and correcting the Terror's course accordingly. Douglas stood behind Nibley, stiff and quiet. Since he was computant mechanic, Nibley was his charge. He was to protect Nibley from harm. Kroll had said so. Douglas didn't like it at all. Nibley was feeling fine. It was like the old days. It was good. He laughed. He waved at nothing outside the port. "Hi there," he called. "Meteor," he explained in an aside to Douglas. "You see it? Lives at stake and you sit there playing." "No, not playing. Just warming up. I can see 'em beating like hell all up and down the line, son. God's truth." "Kroll's a damned fool," said Douglas. "Sure, you had a few lucky breaks in the old days before they built a good computator. A few lucky breaks and you lived off them. Your day's done." "I'm still good." "How about the time you swilled a quart of rot gut and almost killed a cargo of civilian tourists?" "I heard about that. All I have to say is one word and your ears'd twitch. Whiskey." At the word, saliva ran alarmingly in Nibley's mouth. He swallowed guiltily. Douglas, snorting, turned and started from the room. Nibley grabbed a monkey wrench on impulse, heaved it. The wrench hit the wall and fell down. Nibley wheezed. "Wrench got an orbit like everything. Fair bit of computation I did. 1 point over and I'd have flanked that crumb." There was silence now as he hobbled back and sat wearily to stare into the stars. He felt all of the ship's men around him. Vague, warm electrical stirrings of fear, hope, dismay, exhaustion. All their orbits coming into a parallel trajectory now. All living in the same path with him. And the asteroid smashed down with an increasing swiftness. In a very few hours, the main body of missiles would be encountered. Now, as he stared into space, he felt a dark orbit coming into conjunction with his own. It was an unpleasant orbit, one that touched him with fear. It drew closer. It was dark. It was very close now. A moment later, a tall man in a black uniform climbed the rungs from below and stood looking at Nibley. "I'm Bruno," he said. He was a nervous fellow and kept looking around at the walls, the deck, at Nibley. "I'm food specialist on board. How come you're up here? Come down to mess later. Join me in a game of Martian chess." Nibley said, "I'd beat the hell out of you. Wouldn't pay. It's against orders for me to be down below anyways." "How come?" "Never you, never mind. Got things to do up here. I notice things. I'm charting a special course in a special way. Even Captain Kroll don't know every reason why I'm making this trip. Got my own personal reasons. I see 'em coming and going, and I got their orbits picked neat and dandy. Meteors, planets, and men. Why, let me tell you..." Bruno tensed somewhat forward. His face was a little too interested. Nibley didn't like the feel of the man. He was off trajectory. He smelled funny. He felt funny. Nibley shut up. "Nice day," he said. "Go ahead," said Bruno. "You were saying?" Douglas stepped up the rungs. Bruno cut it short, saluted Douglas, and left. Douglas watched him go coldly. "What'd Bruno want?" he asked of the old man. "Captain's orders, you're to see nobody." Nibley's wrinkles made a smile. "Watch that guy, Bruno. I've got his orbit fixed all round and arced. I see him going now, and I see him reaching aphelion, and I see him coming back." Douglas pulled his lip. "You think Bruno might be working for the Martian industrial clique? If I thought he had anything to do with stopping us from getting to the Jovian colony..." "He'll be back," said Nibley, "just before we reach the heavy asteroid belt. Wait and see." The ship swerved. The computators had just dodged a meteor. Douglas smiled. That griped Nibley. The machines were stealing his feathers. Nibley paused and closed his eyes. "Here come 2 more meteors. I've beat the machine this time." They waited. The ship swerved twice. "Damn it," said Douglas. 2 hours passed. "It got lonely upstairs," said Nibley apologetically. Captain Kroll glanced nervously up from the mess table where he and 12 other men sat. Williams, Simpson, Haynes, Bruno, McClure, Leiber, and the rest. All were eating, but not hungry. They all looked a little sick. The ship was swerving again and again, steadily, back and forth. In a short interval, the heavy belt would be touched. Then there would be real sickness. "Okay," said Kroll to Nibley. "You can eat with us this once, and only this once. Remember that." Nibley ate like a starved weasel. Bruno looked over at him again and finally asked, "How about that chess game?" "No, I always win. Don't want to brag, but I was the best outfielder playing baseball when I was at school. Never struck out at bat, neither. Damn good." Bruno cut a piece of meat. "What's your business now, Gramps?" "Finding out where things is going," evaded Nibley. Kroll snapped his gaze at Nibley. The old man hurried on. "Why, I know where the whole blamed universe is heading." Everybody looked up from their eating. "But you wouldn't believe me if I told you," laughed the old man. Somebody whistled. Others chuckled. Kroll relaxed. Bruno scowled. Nibley continued. "It's a feeling. You can't describe stars to a blind man, or God to anybody. Why, hell's bells, lads, if I wanted I could write a formula on paper, and if you worked it out in your mind, you'd drop dead of cymbal poison." Again laughter. A bit of wine was poured all around as a bracer for the hours ahead. Nibley eyed the forbidden stuff and got up. "Well, I got to go." "Have some wine," said Bruno. "No thanks," said Nibley. "Go ahead, have some," said Bruno. "I don't like it," said Nibley, wetting his lips. "That's a laugh," said Bruno, eyeing him. "I got to go upstairs. Nice to have ate with you boys. See you later, after we get through the swarms." Faces became wooden at the mention of the approaching belt. Fingers tightened against the table edge. Nibley spidered back up the rungs to his little room alone. An hour later, Nibley was drunk as a chromium-plated pirate. He kept it a secret. He hid the wine bottle in his shock hammock groggily. Stroke of luck. Oh yes, a stroke of luck. Yes. Finding that lovely, fine, wonderful wine in the storage cabinet near the visiport. Why, yes. And since he'd been thirsty for so long. Well, gurgle, gurgle. Nibley was drunk. He swayed before the visiport, drunkenly deciding the trajectories of 1,000 invisible nothings. Then he began to argue with himself, drowsily, as he always argued when wine webs were being spun through his skull by red, drowsy spiders. His heart beat dully. His little sharp eyes flickered with sudden flights of anger. "You're some liar, Mr. Nibley," he told himself. "You point at meteors, but who's to prove you right or wrong, eh? You sit up here and wait and wait and wait. Those machines down below spoil it. You never have a chance to prove your ability. No, the captain won't use you. He won't need you. None of those men believe in you. Think you're a liar. Laugh at you. Yes, laugh. Yes, they call you an old liar." Nibley's thin nostrils quivered. His thin, wrinkled face was crimsoned and wild. He staggered to his feet, got hold of his favourite monkey wrench, and waved it slowly back and forth. For a moment his heart almost stopped in him. In panic he clutched at his chest, pushing, pulling, pumping at his heart to keep it running. The wine, the excitement. He dropped the wrench. "No, not yet." He looked down at his chest, wildly tearing at it. "Not just yet. Oh, please," he cried. "Not until I show them." His heart went on beating, drunkenly, slowly. He bent, retrieved the wrench, and laughed numbly. "I'll show 'em," he cried, weaving across the deck. "Show them how good I am. Eliminate competition. I'll run the ship myself." He climbed slowly down the rungs to destroy the machines. It made a lot of noise. Nibley heard a shout. "Get him!" His hand went down again. There was a scream of whistles, a jarring of flung metal, a minor explosion. His hand went down again, the wrench in it. He felt himself cursing and pounding away. Something shattered. Men ran toward him. This was the computator. He hit upon it once more. Yes! Then he was caught up like an empty sack, smashed in the face by someone's fist, thrown to the deck. "Cut acceleration!" a voice cried far away. The ship slowed. Somebody kicked Nibley in the face. Blackness. Dark. Around and around, down into darkness. When he opened his eyes again, people were talking. "We're turning back." "The hell we are. Kroll says we'll go on anyway." "That's suicide. We can't hit that asteroid belt without radar." Nibley looked up from the floor. Kroll was there, over him, looking down at the old man. "I might have known," he said, over and over again. He wavered in Nibley's sobering vision. The ship hung motionless, silent. Through the ports, Nibley saw they were based on the sunward side of a large planetoid, waiting, shielded from most of the asteroid particles. "I'm sorry," said Nibley. "He's sorry," Kroll swore. "The very man we bring along as relief computator sabotages our machine. Hell!" Bruno was in the room. Nibley saw Bruno's eyes dilate at Kroll's exclamation. Bruno knew now. Nibley tried to get up. "We'll get through the swarm anyway. I'll take you through. That's why I broke that blasted contraption. I don't like competition. I can clear a path through them asteroids big enough to tug Luna through on track 5. "Who gave you the wine?" "I found it. I just found it, that's all." The crew hated him with their eyes. He felt their hatred like so many meteors coming in and striking at him. They hated his shriveled, wrinkled, old man guts. They stood around and waited for Kroll to let them kick him apart with their boots. Kroll walked around the old man in a circle. "You think I'd chance you getting us through the belt?" he snorted. "What if we got half through and you got potted again?" He stopped with his back to Nibley. He was thinking. He kept looking over his shoulder at the old man. "I can't trust you." He looked out the port at the stars, at where Jupiter shone in space. "And yet," he looked at the men, Do you want to turn back? Nobody moved. They didn't have to answer. They didn't want to go back. They wanted to go ahead. We'll keep on going then, said Kroll. Bruno spoke. We crew members should have some say. I say go back. We can't make it. We're just wasting our lives. Kroll glanced at him coolly. You seem to be alone. He went back to the port. He rocked on his heels. It was no accident Nibley got that wine. Somebody planted it, knowing Nibley's weakness. Somebody who was paid off by the Martian industrials to keep this ship from going through. This was a clever setup. The machines were smashed in such a way as to throw suspicion directly on an innocent, well, almost innocent party. Nibley was just a tool. I'd like to know who handled that tool. Nibley got up, the wrench in his gnarled hand. I'll tell you who planted that wine. I've been thinking, and now... Darkness. A short circuit. Feet running on the metal deck. A shout. A thread of fire across the darkness. Then a whistling as something flew, hit. Someone grunted. The lights came on again. Nibley was at the light control. On the floor, gun in hand, eyes beginning to numb, lay Bruno. He lifted the gun, fired it. The bullet hit Nibley in the stomach. Nibley grabbed at the pain. Kroll kicked at Bruno's head. Bruno's head snapped back. He lay quietly. The blood pulsed out between Nibley's fingers. He watched it with interest, grinning with pain. I knew his orbit, he whispered, sitting down cross-legged on the deck. When the lights went out, I chose my own orbit back to the light switch. I knew where Bruno'd be in the dark. Having a wrench handy, I let fly, choosing my arc naturally. Guess he's got a hard skull, though. They carried Nibley to a bunk. Douglas stood over him, dimly, growing older every second. Nibley squinted up. All the men tightened in upon it. Nibley felt their dismay, their dread, their worry, their nervous anger. Finally, Kroll exhaled. Turn the ship around, he said. Go back to Mars. The crew stood with their limp hands at their sides. They were tired. They didn't want to live anymore. They just stood with their feet on the deck. Then, one by one, they began to walk away like so many cold, dead men. Hold on, cried Nibley, weakening. I ain't through yet. I got 2 orbits to fix. I got one to lay out for this ship to Jupiter, and I got to finish out my own separate, secret, personal orbit. You ain't turning back nowhere. Kroll grimaced. Might as well realize it, Grandpa. It takes 7 hours to get through the swarms, and you haven't got another 2 hours in you. The old man laughed. Think I don't know that? Hell, who's supposed to know all these things, me or you? You, Pop. Well then, damn it, bring me a Bolger. Now look, you heard me, by God, a Bolger. Why? You ever hear of a thing called triangulation? Well, maybe I won't live long enough to go with you, but by all the sizes and shapes of behemoths, this ship is jumping through to Jupiter. Kroll looked at him. There was a breathing silence, a heart-beating silence in the ship. Kroll sucked in his breath, hesitated, then smiled a grey smile. You heard him, Douglas. Get him a Bolger. And get a stretcher, and tote this 90 pounds of bone out on the biggest asteroid around here. Got that? You heard him, Haynes. A stretcher. Stand by for manoeuvring. Kroll sat down by the old man. What's it all about, Pop? You're sober? Clear as a bell. What are you going to do? Redeem myself of my sins, by George. Now get your ugly face away so I can think. And tell them bucks to hurry. Kroll bellowed, and men rushed. They brought a spacesuit, inserted the 90 pounds of shrill and wheeze and weakness into it. The doctor had finished with his probings and fixings, buckled, zipped, and welded him into it. All the while they worked, Nibley talked. Remember when I was a kid? Stood up to that there plate pounding out baseballs north, south, and 6 ways from Sundays. He chuckled. Used to hit 'em and predict which window in what house they'd break. Wheezy laughter. One day I said to my dad, "Hey Dad, a meteor just fell on Simpson's garage over in Jonesville." "Jonesville is 6 miles from here," said my father, shaking his finger at me. "You quit your lying, Nibley boy, or I'll trot you to the woodshed." "Save your strength," said Kroll. "That's all right," said Nibley. "You know, the funny thing was always that I lied like hell, and everybody said I lied like hell. But come to find out later, I wasn't lying at all. It was the truth. I just sensed things." The ship manoeuvred down on a windless, empty planetoid. Nibley was carried on a stretcher out onto alien rock. "Lay me down right here. Prop up my head so I can see Jupiter and the whole damned asteroid belt. Be sure my headphones are tuned neat. There. Now, give me a piece of paper." Nibley scribbled a long, weak snake of writing on a paper, folded it. "When Bruno comes to, give him this. Maybe he'll believe me when he reads it. Personal. Don't pry into it yourself." The old man sank back, feeling pain drilling through his stomach and a kind of sad happiness. Somebody was singing somewhere, he didn't know where. Maybe it was only the stars moving on the sky. "Well," he said clearly, "guess this is it, children. Now get the hell aboard. Leave me alone to think. This is going to be the biggest, hardest, damnedest job of computating I ever latched onto. There'll be orbits and cross-orbits, big balls of fire and little bitty specules, and by God, I'll chart 'em all. I'll chart 100,000 of the damn monsters and their offspring. You just wait and see. Get aboard. I'll tell you what to do from there on." Douglas looked doubtful. Nibley caught the look. "Whatever happens," he cried, "will be worth it, won't it? It's better than turning back to Mars, ain't it? Well, ain't it?" "It's better," said Douglas. They shook hands. "Now all of you, get!" Nibley watched the ship fire away, and his eyes saw it and the asteroid swarm and that brilliant point of light that was massive Jupiter. He could almost feel the hunger and want and waiting up there in that star flame. He looked out into space, and his eyes widened, and space came in, opened out like a flower, and already, natural as water flowing, Nibley's mind, tired as it was, began to shiver out calculations. He started talking. "Captain, take the ship straight out now, you hear?" "Fine," answered the captain. "Look at your dials." "Looking." "If number 7 reads 132.87, okay. Keep her there. If she varies a point, counteract it on dial 20 to 56.90. Keep her hard over for 70,000 miles. All that is clear so far. Then, after that, a sharp veer in number 2 direction, over 1,000 miles. There's a big sweep of meteors coming in on that path for you to dodge. Let me see, he figured. Keep your speed at a constant of 100,000 miles. At that rate, check your clocks and watches. In exactly an hour, you'll hit the second part of the Big Belt. Then switch to a course roughly 5,000 miles over to number 3 direction. Veer again 5 minutes on the dot later and... Can you see all those asteroids, Nibley? Are you sure? Sure, lots of them. Every single one going every which way. Keep straight ahead until 2 hours from now, after that last direction of mine. then slide off at an angle toward Jupiter, slow down to 90,000 for 10 minutes, then up to 110,000 for 15 minutes. After that, 150,000 all the way. Flame poured out of the rocket jets. It moved swiftly away, growing small and distant. Give me a read on dial 67. 4. Make it 6. And set your automatic pilot to 61 and 14 and 35. Now, everything's okay. Keep your chronometer reading this way, 7, 9, 12. There'll be a few tight scrapes, but you'll hit Jupiter square on in 24 hours if you jump your speed to 700,000 6 hours from now and hold it that way. Square on it is, Mr. Nibley. Nibley just lay there a moment. His voice was easy and not so high and shrill anymore. And on the way back to Mars later, don't try to find me. I'm going out in the dark on this metal rock. Nothing but dark for me. Back to perihelion and sun for you. Know where I'm going? Where? Centaurus, Nibley laughed. So help me God I am. No lie. He watched the ship going out then, and he felt the compact, collected trajectories of all the men in it. It was a good feeling to know that he was the guiding theme, like in the old days. Douglas's voice broke in again. Hey, Pop, you still there? A little silence. Nibley felt blood pulsing down inside his suit. Yep, he said. We just gave Bruno your little note to read. Whatever it was, when he finished reading it, he went insane. Nibley said, quiet-like, Burn that there paper. Don't let anybody else read it. A pause. It's burnt. What was it? Don't be so inquisitive, snapped the old man. Maybe I proved to Bruno that he didn't really exist. To hell with it. The rocket reached its constant speed. Douglas radioed back. All's well. Sweet calculating, Pop. I'll tell the rocket officials back at Marsport. They'll be glad to know about you. Sweet calculating. Thanks. How goes it? I said, how goes it? Hey, Pop. Pop? Nibley raised a trembling hand and waved it at nothing. The ship was gone. He couldn't even see the jet wash now. He could only feel that hard metal movement out there among the stars, going on and on through a course he had set for it. He couldn't speak. There was just emotion in him. He had finally, by God, heard a compliment from a mechanic of radar computators. He waved his hand at nothing. He watched nothing moving on and on into the crossed orbits of other invisible nothings. The silence was now complete. He put his hand down. Now he had only to chart that one last personal orbit, the one he had wanted to finish only in space and not grounded back on Mars. It didn't take lightning calculation to set it out for certain. Life and death were the parabolic ends to his trajectory. The long life first swinging in from darkness, arcing to the inevitable perihelion, and now moving back out and away, into the soft, encompassing dark. By God, he thought weakly, quietly. Right up to the last, my reputation's good. Never fluked a calculation yet, and I never will. He didn't. Remember to hit the like button to help the channel grow and this video spread. Thanks. A Hitch in Space by Fritz Leiber. Narrated by William Skye. My space partner was a good, reliable sidekick, but his partner was something else. Once, when I was doing a hitch with the Shoreland Space Guard out Scorpio way, my partner Jeff Bogart developed just about the most harmless psychosis you could imagine, He got himself an imaginary companion. And the imaginary companion turned out to be me. Well, I'm a pretty nice guy, and so having two of me in the ship didn't seem a particularly bad idea, at first. In fact, there'd be advantages of it, I thought. For instance, Jeff liked to talk a weary lot, and the imaginary Johansson could spell me listening to him while I projected a book or just hearkened to the wheels going around in my own head against the faint patter of starlight on the hull. I met Jeff first at a space radio, oddly enough, but now the two of us were out on a servicing check of the orbital beacons and relays and rescue depots of the 5 planets of the Shoreland system. A completely routine job, its only drawback that it was lengthy. Our ship was an ionic jeep that looked like a fancy fountain pen, but was very roomy for 3 men, one of them imaginary. I caught on to Jeff's little mania by overhearing him talking to me. I'd be coming back from the head or stores or linear accelerator on my bunk, and I'd hear him yakking at me. It embarrassed me the first time, how to go back into the cabin when the other me was there. But I just swam in, and without any transition strain at all that I could observe, Jeff looked around at me, smiling, sort of glaze-eyed, and said warmly, "Joe! My buddy Joe! Am I glad they paired us?" If Jeff had a major fault, as opposed to a species of nuttiness, it was that he was strictly a speak-only good, positive-thinking guy who always deferred to me. Even idolized me, if you can imagine that. He'd give me such fulsome praise I'd be irked 10 times an orbit. Another thing that helped me catch on was that he always called the other me Joseph. At first, I thought the whole thing might be a gag, or maybe a deliberate way of letting off steam against me without violating his always a sweet guy code, like happy husbands cursing in the bathroom. But then came the scrambled eggs. I'd slept late, and when I squinted into the cabin, there was Jeff hovering over a plate of yellow fluff and shaking his finger at my empty seat and saying, "Damn it, Joseph, eat your scrambled eggs. I cooked 'em specially for you." And when he crawfished out toward the galley a couple seconds later, he was saying, "Now you start on those eggs, Joseph, before I get back." I thought for a bit, and then I slid into my place and polished them off. When he floated in with the coffee, he gave me another of those glaze-eyed, God-fearing looks, but just a mite disappointed, I thought, and said, "Damn it, Joe, you're perfect. You always clean your plate." Apparently, when I was there, Joseph just didn't exist for Jeff, and vice versa. It was sort of eerie, especially with the hum of space in my ears like a seashell and nobody else for 5 million miles. Beginning with the scrambled eggs, I discovered that Jeff didn't exactly idolize Joseph, or even take with him the attitude of my buddy can do no wrong like he did with me. I overheard him criticizing Joseph. Reasonably, at first. Then I heard him chewing him out. Next, bullying him. It made me wistful, that last, thinking how good it would feel to be full-bloodedly cursed to my face once in a while instead of all the sweetness and light. And right there I got the idea for some amateur therapy. Sure Ledever helped me. I waited for a moment when we were both relaxed, and then I said, "Jeff, the trouble with you is you're too nice. You ought to criticize things more. For a starter, criticize me. Tell me my faults. Go ahead." He flushed a little and said, "Damn it, Joe, how can I? You're perfect." "No man is perfect, Jeff," I told him solemnly, feeling pretty foolish. "But you're my buddy I can always trust," he protested, squirming a bit. "I wish you wouldn't talk this way." "Jeff, you can't trust anybody too far," I said. "Even good guys can do bad things. When I was a boy, there was a kid named Harry I practically worshipped. We lived on a pioneer world of Fomalhaut that had good snow, and we'd hitch rides with our sleds off little airscrew planes taking off. We'd each have a long white line on his sled and loop it beforehand around the plane's tail gear and back to the sled. Then we'd hide. As soon as the pilot got aboard, we'd jump on our sleds and each grab the free end of his line and have one comet of a ride until the plane took off. Then we'd quick let go. Well, one frosty morning I let go and nothing happened except I started to rise. Harry had tied the free end of my line tight to my sled. I could have just rolled off, I suppose, but I didn't want to lose my sled or my line either. Luckily I had a sheath knife handy and I used it. I even made a whizaroo of a landing. But ever afterwards my feeling toward Harry— "Stop it, please, Joe," Jeff interrupted, very red in the face and shaking a little. "That boy Harry was utterly evil. And I don't want to hear any more about this or anything like it ever again. Understand?" I told him sure I did. Heck, I could see I'd gone the wrong way about it. I even begged his pardon. After that, I just sweated it out. But I found I couldn't spend much time on books or my thoughts. I'd keep listening for what Jeff was saying to Joseph. And sometimes when he'd pause for Joseph's reply, I'd catch myself waiting for the imaginary me to make one. So I took to staying in the same cabin as Jeff as much as I could. That seemed to make him uncomfortable after a while, though he pretended to glory in it. He'd ask me questions like, "Tell me about life, Joe, so I'll know how to handle myself if we're ever parted." But the weariest things come to an end, even duty orbits around Shola. And so the time came when we were servicing our last beacon, outside the planet Shola Bai it was. Next step would be a fast interplanetary orbit for base at Shola Near. I was out working on a safety line, of course, but suit jetting around more than I needed to just for the pure joy of it, so that my suit tank was almost dry. I'd switched my suit radio off for a bit because, working in space, Jeff had taken to just gabbling to me nervously all the time, maybe because he figured there couldn't be room for Joseph with him in his suit. I finished up and paused for a last look at the ship. She was sweetly slim from her conical living quarters to the taper tail of her ionic jet, but she had more junk on her than an amateur asteroid prospector hangs on his suit the first time out. Every duty orbit, 50 scientists come with permission from the commandant to hang some automatic research gadget on the hull. The craziest one this time was a huge flattened band of gold-plated aluminium, little more than foil thick, attached crosswise just in front of the tail and sticking out 20 feet on each side. I don't know what it was there for, maybe to measure the effects of space on a Mobius strip, but it looked like a wedding ring that had been stepped on. So Jeff and I called it Trompled Love. But in spite of the junk, the ship looked mighty sweet against the saffron steppes and baby blue seas of Shola Bai, with Shola herself, old Lambda Scorpii, flaming warm and wildly beyond, and with United States standing out big as life on the ship's living quarters. United States of Shola, of course. I was almost dreaming out there, thinking how it hadn't been such a terrible duty after all, when I saw the ship began to slide past Shola. Poking out of her tail, ghostlier than the flame over a Café Royale, was the evil blue glow of her jet. In an instant I'd guessed exactly what had happened and was beating myself on the head for not having anticipated it. Joseph had swum into the cabin right after Jeff, and Jeff had yelled at him, "It's about time, you lazy lunkhead! Everything secure? Okay, I'm switching on the beam." And I'd probably brought the whole thing about by telling him that damn fool sled story, and then sticking to him so close he just had to get rid of me so as to be with Joseph. Meanwhile, the ship was gathering speed in her sneaky way, and the wavy safety line between me and the airlock was starting to straighten. As you know, an ionic jet's only good space to space. It's not for heavy G work. Ours could deliver only 1/2 G at max and was doing less than 1/4 now. Which meant the ship was starting off slower than most ground cars. But the beam would fire for hours, building up to a terminal velocity of 15 miles a second and carrying the ship far, far away from lonely Joe Hansen. Except that we were tied together, of course. I was very grateful then for the weeks I'd practiced space roping, though I'd never won any prizes with it, because without thinking, I started to whip my line very carefully. And on the third try, just as it was getting pretty straight, I managed to settle it in a notch in one outside end of Trumpled Love. After that, I took up strain on the line as gradually as I could, letting it friction through my gloves for as long as I could before putting all my mass on it, because although 1/4 G isn't much, it piles up in a few seconds to quite a jerk. I spread that jerk into several little ones. Well, the last jerk came and the line didn't part, and Trumpled Love didn't crumple much, though the Schorler light showed me several very nasty-looking wrinkles in it. And there I was, trailing along after the ship, though out to one side, and feeling about as much strain on the line as if I were hanging from a cliff on the moon, and knowing I was going about 5 feet a second faster every second. My idea wanting to be out to the side, and bless my impulses for realizing it was the one important thing, was to keep my line and myself out of the beam. An ionic jet doesn't look hot from the side, but from straight on it's a lot brighter than an arc light. It's almost as tight as a laser beam, and I didn't want to think about what it would do to me, even trailing as I was 100 yards aft. Though of course long before it had ruined me, it would have disintegrated my line. My being out to the side was putting the ship off balance on its jet and presumably throwing its course toward base and Schorler near little by little into error. But that was the least of my worries, believe me. I thought for a bit and remembered I could talk to Jeff over my suit radio. I decided to try it, not without misgivings. I tongued it on and said, "Jeff! Oh, Jeff, I'm out here. You forgot me." I was going to say some more, but just then he broke in, angry and so loud it made my helmet ring with, "Joseph, did you hear anything then?" A pause, then, "Well, clean the wax out of your ears, stupid, because I did. I think we got an enemy out there." Another and longer pause while my blood curdled a bit thicker, then, "Well, okay, Joseph, I'll go along with you this time. But if I hear the enemy once more, I'm going to suit up and take a rifle and sit in the airlock door until I've potted him." I tongued the radio off quick, fearful I'd sneeze or something. I had only one faint consolation. Joseph seemed to be a bit on my side, or maybe he was just lazy. I thought some more, a mite frantic like now, and after a while I said to myself, "Been going 5 minutes now, so I'm doing about 1/4 of a mile a second. That's 15 miles a minute, wow. But out here velocities are purely relative. My suit does a little better than 1/4 G full on. Okay, I'll jet to the ship." No sooner said than acted on. I was beginning to rely too much on impulse now. The suit jet killed my false weight at once, and I was off, mighty careful to aim myself along my line or a little outside it so as not to wander over into the beam. Pretty soon the tail and Trumpled Love were getting noticeably bigger. Then a lot bigger. Then my suit fuel ran out. I'd built up enough velocity so that I was still gaining on the ship for a few seconds. In fact, I almost made it. My gauntlet was about to close on Trumpled Love when the ship started slowly to pull away. Oh, it was frustrating. I remembered then what I should have a lot earlier and grabbed for the ship end of my line so as not to lose the distance I'd gained, and in my haste I knocked it away from me. The only good thing was that I didn't knock it out of the notch. Now I was losing space to the ship faster and faster. Yet all I could do was reel in the me end of the line as fast as I could. Suddenly the whole line straightened and gave me a bigger jerk than I'd intended. I could see Trumpled Love crumple a little. And I was swinging just a bit, like a pendulum. I used a glove friction to spread the rest of the jerk, but still I was at the end of my line and Trompled Love had crumpled a bit more before I was coasting along with the ship again. My side of Trompled Love was bent back maybe 20 degrees. The eye of the beam shone at me from the tail like a pale blue moon. For quite a while it brightened and dimmed as I tick-tock swung. Meanwhile, I was beating my skull for not having thought earlier of the obvious slow but safe way of doing it, instead of that lunatic suit jetting. I once heard a psychologist say we're mental slaves to power machinery, and I guess he had something. Clearly, all I had to do was climb hand over hand up the line to the ship. At moon gravity, that would be easy. If I should get tired, I only had to clamp on and rest. So I waited for my emotions to settle a bit, and then I reached along the line and gave a smooth, medium-strength heave. Maybe there is something to ESP, at least in a devilish sort of way, because I picked the exact moment when Jeff decided to feed the beam more juice. There was a big jerk, and I saw Trompled Love crumple a lot so that it was pointing more than 45 degrees aft. Now there was a steady pull on the line like I was hanging from a cliff on Mars. And the eye of the beam was a blue moon, not so pale, in fact, more like a sizzling blue sun seen through a light fog. After that, I just didn't have the heart to try the climb again. Once I started to draw myself up, very cautious, but on the first handhold I seemed to feel along the line Trompled Love crumpling some more, and I quit for good. I figured that at this boost, Jeff would be up to proper speed for Shawla Near in less than 2 hours. Well, I had suit oxy and refrigeration for longer than that. Of course, if Jeff decided not to cut the beam on schedule, maybe with the idea of eloping with Joseph to the next solar system, well, I'd discover then whether suit oxy running out would stimulate me to try the climb again alongside the beam. Or I could wait until he got her up near the speed of light, when by the general theory of relativity the line ought to be shortened enough so that I could hop aboard if I was sudden enough about it. No, Johansson, you quit that, I told myself. You don't want to die with the gears in your head all stripped. Thinking about the beam got me wondering exactly how close I was to it. I unshipped my suit antenna and pulled it out to full length, about 8 feet, and fished around with it in the direction of the beam. Nothing seemed to happen to it. It didn't glow or anything, but I suddenly got a little electric shock, and when I drew it back I could see 3 inches of the tip were gone and the next couple inches were pitted. So much for curiosity. Next I reattached the antenna to my suit, which turned out to be a lot more troublesome job than unshipping it, and tongued on the radio with the idea of listening in on Jeff. Right away I heard him say, "Wake up, Joseph. I'm going to tell you your faults again. I got a new way of cataloguing them, chronologically. Begin with childhood. You hitched sled rides on airplanes. That was bad, Joseph. That was against the law. If the man had caught you doing it, if he'd seen you whizzing along there back of him, he'd have had every right to shoot you down in cold blood. Life is hard, Joseph. Life is merciless." Right then I felt a tickle in my throat. I tried quick to shut off the radio, but it is remarkably difficult to tongue anything when you have a cough coming. It came out finally in a series of squeaky glubs. "Snap to, Joseph, and listen hard," I heard Jeff say. "It started again. Animal noises this time. You know if they make spacesuits for Black Panthers, Joseph?" I tongued off the radio quick before the follow-up cough came. I didn't have anything left to do now but think. So I thought about Jeff, how there seemed to be one Jeff who hated my guts, and another Jeff who idolized me, and another Jeff sneaking around in a jungle of saber-toothed tigers, and heck, there was probably a good 20 Jeffs sitting around inside his skull, some in light, some in darkness, but all of them watching each other and arguing together all the time. It was an odd way to think of a personality, a sort of perpetual kaffee clutch, but it had its points. Maybe some of the little guys weren't Jeff's at all, but his father and mother and a caveman ancestor or two, and maybe some great-great-grandchild butting in now and then from the future. Well, I saw that speculation was getting out of hand, so taking a tip from Jeff, I began to count my own sins. It took quite a while. Some of them were pretty interesting reading, almost enough to take my mind off my predicament, but I tired of it finally. Then I began to count the stars. It was really the longest 2 hours plus I ever spent, except maybe the time my first big girl disappeared. But I don't know. The experiences are hard to compare. I was about halfway through the stars when I went weightless. For an awful instant I thought the line had parted at last, but then I looked toward the ship and saw the bright little moon was gone. Right away I gave a couple of tugs on the line and began to close slowly with the tail. No trouble at all. Actually, my only difficulty was resisting the temptation to build up more momentum, which would have resulted in a crash landing. I softed in on Trompled Love okay, except there was a big spark. The beam must have charged me good. Then I worked my way to the true hull. After that there were handholds. Finally, I got to a porthole in the living quarters, and I looked in, and there was Jeff jawing away at my empty seat. I put my helmet against the hull, and very faintly I heard him say, "Joseph, I'm still worried about the enemy. I keep thinking I hear him, or it. I'm going to make us some coffee so we'll stay real alert. You break out the guns." I don't suppose anyone ever moved quite so quietly and so quickly in a spacesuit as I did then. I got in the airlock, I got her up to pressure, I got unsuited, and all in less than 5 minutes, I'm sure, maybe less than 4. I swam to the cabin. It was empty. I slid into my seat just as Jeff floated in with the coffee. He went real pale when he spotted me. I saw there might be some trouble this time with the Joseph Joe transition, but I knew the only way to play it was real cool. I nested there in my seat as if I hadn't a worry or urge in the world, though my nerves and throat were just screaming for a squirt of that coffee. "Joe," he squeaked at last. "My God, you gave me an awful scare. I thought you'd done a bunk. I thought you'd spaced yourself. I kept picturing you outside the ship." "Why, no, Jeff," I answered quietly. "One way or another I've been in this seat ever since takeoff." His brow wrinkled as he thought about that. I looked at the board and noticed that our terminal trip velocity read 15 miles a second. My. Finally, Jeff said, "That's right, you have." And then, just a shade unhappily, "I might have known. You always tell the truth, Joe. You're perfect." Thanks for listening. Remember, for many more stories, including 3 free ones per week, go and check out my Substack. There's a variety of formats and genres, which I can do without needing to cater to YouTube's algorithms, and you can also get them all in podcast form if that suits you better. So head to storiesfromtheskysff.substack.com, link in the description. See you there.